Figma is design's hottest startup, recently valued at $10 billion and on a mission to make design accessible to all. Its software has scored an all-star lineup of customers, including Airbnb, Google, Uber, GitHub, and even Joe Biden's campaign manager. And it all started with a 19-year-old college dropout and drones? I'm April Alter, and this is the story of Figma. Dylan was born in 1992 and grew up in Pengrove, California. As a child, Dylan was a math whiz, learning algebra when he was only 6 years old. He found middle school so boring that he mostly hung out with a janitor who was a bit of a math savant himself. Dylan was very much into the arts when he was young, acting his way into a local play, and even becoming successful enough to have agents in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, booking commercial and TV work in addition to theater. Completely wild, I know. He developed an interest in design in middle school and continued acting until he hit puberty, got awkward, and went into computers. F and chat for an acting career. Dylan went to high school at a tech-focused magnet school in Sonoma County, California. There, he started to build robots and websites for friends. In 2009, Dylan enrolled at Brown University, one of the world-renowned Ivy League universities, where he studied computer science and math. That next summer, he quickly scored an internship at LinkedIn, working in the software engineering department. But although Dylan excelled at his internship, he just wasn't happy. At his core, he was interested in product and design. And although he was okay at computer science and math, he knew that there were so many people in the world way better than he was. And so that next summer, instead of seeking out another software engineering internship, and despite having no real design experience, he sought out a design internship. We'll see this theme again and again in Dylan's story. Huge pivots based heavily on his gut feeling or intuition, which leads us to lesson 1. Don't be afraid to pivot. I don't know if you've made a significant pivot in life before, but I can tell you from personal experience that it is absolutely terrifying. When all of your peers are focused in one area, and that's all you know and all that you've invested your time in, it can be the scariest thing in the world to transition away from that. But there can be huge benefits to taking these kinds of leaps. I've jumped from Wall Street banking all the way over to content creation on YouTube and Twitter, and the opportunities I got from taking risks like these prove just how right Dylan was. So Dylan sought out a design internship, and he found one at news sharing service Flipboard. Through this internship, he realized these were the types of problems he wanted to tackle full-time. This would be the seed from which Figma would eventually grow. Around this time, Dylan also got to know one of his TAs at school, Evan Wallace. They clicked well and decided to build something together. Evan had interned at Pixar and Microsoft, and during this time at Pixar, he had used WebGL to create a demo involving a sphere in a pool of water. It might not look like much, but it showed them that you could have real-time graphics in the browser. The power of this new technology immediately got both of them thinking of what new companies they could build with it. So they sat down and started brainstorming startup ideas. They made a list of the technologies that were changing the world, considering everything from game engines to drones. One of the ideas they brainstormed was Figma in a different form. During his time at Flipboard, Dylan was browsing TechCrunch when he came across an interesting program called the Thiel Fellowship. This program was incredibly exclusive, only admitting 20 people per class. It was designed specifically for young people who wanted to build new things. If you were accepted, you'd receive a $100,000 grant and support from a network of founders, investors, and scientists. This grant was non-dilutive, meaning they took no equity. Just $100,000 given to you over 2 years to start your own company. Sounds pretty good, right? The catch? If you were accepted, you would have to drop out of college. Dylan applied to the fellowship on a whim, figuring that he'd probably need some cash. He decided to get meta-contrarian in some of his answers. When asked, what's one thing you believe about the world to be true that others don't, he wrote an essay about how he didn't like chocolate. Dylan applied to the fellowship with one of the ideas he and Evan had brainstormed, an idea around drones. Miraculously, Dylan scored the Thiel Fellowship. Evan, a year ahead of Dylan, got to finish his degree. But Dylan, just 1 year before he was set to graduate from Brown University, dropped out of college to accept the fellowship. That's a pretty loaded sentence. Figuring he needed some cash, Dylan won a huge grant and immediately dropped out of college. How many of us could do that? That brings us to lesson number 2. If you know what you want, don't wait for it to come to you. Go after it with all that you've got. If Dylan hadn't chased after the Thiel Fellowship and had the bravery to drop out of college, he may not be the billionaire he is today. But of course, that doesn't mean it was easy. The decision was of quite some concern to his parents, who had spent around $130,000 at that point on Dylan's education at the Ivy League school. As a respiratory therapist at a hospital and a resource specialist teacher at an elementary school, pretty much everything they earned went into education. But despite their desire to see Dylan graduate from Brown before going on to the next thing, his parents were ultimately supportive, knowing that Dylan was always one to follow his own unique path. So Dylan dropped out and Evan graduated, but soon they started to question their drone concept. They just couldn't come up with a drone idea that didn't hurt people or violate their privacy. So they went back to the drawing board and selected an idea from their original brainstorm, an idea that would later morph into what would become Figma, a browser-based photo editing tool. They were obsessed with the concept of browser-based tools. Having grown up using tools like Google Docs and Google Sheets in school, they understood the power of collaboration that internet-native tools could harness. And that got them thinking, what if Photoshop existed in the browser? This was the birth of Figma, as in figment of your imagination made real. Equipped with their new idea and the $100,000 grant, Dylan and Evan moved to San Francisco to devote themselves full-time to Figma. They weren't looking for much, just 2 computers and desks, internet connection, and maybe some office space. In the Bay Area, they started shadowing designers at tech firms they knew from their network of friends, families, and colleagues. Dylan and Evan's dream of building Photoshop in a shareable web browser was pretty lofty. So, to put themselves on the map, they built a tool for supporters to paste themselves into photos of Barack Obama. Barack Obama? In a design tool? Is this marketing? Well, if you haven't heard the stories of Airbnb's Obama-O's and Captain McCain's, this may sound pretty crazy to you, but this leads us to lesson number 3. Small free tools or products can be leveraged for virality. Often, startups are run by 1 or 2 very technical people, which makes marketing particularly hard. But smart founders can use this advantage to build small free tools that can go viral and put them on the map. We'll see in Dylan's story that being on the map is incredibly important, especially once they start to go after investment. Now, Dylan knew that they were onto something, but they needed money, lots of it. And so he set his eyes on obtaining some seed funding. Dylan set his sights on LinkedIn then CEO Jeff Weiner, Danny Reimer's Index Ventures, John Lilly of Greylock, and others. Index said they were in, leading the round with $2 million. Jeff Weiner and others followed, but Greylock passed on the round, and this rejection was perhaps just as valuable as the money. In conversations with Dylan, John Lilly said, "Look, I really like you guys. I like what you're doing, but I don't think you know what you're doing yet." Up to that point, the Figma team hadn't been clear enough in its pitch about what the product was and what problems it solved. Dylan realized that John was right. They didn't know what they were doing, both from a business standpoint and from a strategy standpoint as well. And in taking this rejection, Dylan did something very, very special. He asked to keep meeting with John for feedback. This is huge. Rejection hurts. It hurts so much. I personally struggle a lot with taking rejection well, which is one of the many reasons why I admire Dylan so much. Here's lesson number 4. The best entrepreneurs, the ones who are going to survive, they learn from rejection, no matter where it comes from. Dylan could have been enraged, distraught, or even driven to shut down the entire company to give up. But instead, he asked for continued feedback. This is one of the most powerful tools in the entrepreneurial tool belt, which brings us to lesson number 5. Get a good mentor and keep them. A lot of you out there are solo founders, and it's incredibly important to get ideas outside of your own head, to know if you're actually insane or if you're just being the right amount of crazy. And Dylan didn't stop with his new mentor, John Lilly. In one of their later conversations, John made an offhand comment that former Adobe CEO Bruce Chizen may be helpful for advice. And what did Dylan do? He tracked down and spoke with the Adobe veteran. Remember, no matter how cool your idea is or how smart you think you are, it's always helpful to have other smart people in your corner. Dylan was able to form a relationship with John so strong that later Greylock was the firm to lead their Series A. But that's getting too far ahead of ourselves. Back to the story. Even with Greylock's rejection, Figma was able to raise $3.8 million in seed funding. With the funding secured, it was time to build. This is when things got really tough. Hiring was hard. Many potential hires simply said, I don't want to work for a 20-year-old. And even when they could make hires, they didn't hire perfectly. At that point, Dylan had some leadership experience from some college activities and clubs, but he had no idea of what it meant to manage someone. He hired people who were high skill, but not necessarily a good cultural fit. Heck, at that point, he didn't really know what the culture even was yet. But he was able to put together a team, and together they started building. The problem was they hadn't really determined their mission or purpose. They just referred to what they were building as Photoshop in the browser, which was incredibly vague because Photoshop had a million different use cases. As a result, everyone in the company had a different vision of what they were trying to build. It was chaos. One day, enough was enough. Dylan had everyone in the company sit down and decide the focus of what they were building. During that meeting, a number of features the team wanted to build were brought up: animation, 3D design, photo editing, painting, and more. In what Dylan now refers to as the most controversial decision made at Figma, they scrapped all of those ideas to focus on interface design. Dylan saw that even though design is inherently collaborative, popular design tools were all single player and offline at the time. The Adobe Creative Cloud was really only cloud in name only. Dylan thought this was an amazing opportunity to innovate in a market that hadn't seen much change in decades, and he figured that if there was even a 5% chance that they would succeed, they should take it. Coming to this decision was controversial and painful, but once everyone was on the same page, they were able to move much faster. In your own founder stories, there will be a lot of moments like this. Difficult conversations, pivots, shooting down ideas, things you don't even want to think about today. But remember, these are the conversations that make or break your business, which leads us to lesson number 6. Don't run away from difficult conversations. Be ready for them and embrace them. Understand what you value and what's most important. Be ready to pivot and throw everything all away if that's what it takes to build the right thing. This wasn't the end of early Figma woes, though. Dylan was learning about management in real time. He wasn't a leader yet. This resulted in the test version of Figma's product taking years to launch. Many frustrated team members quit before it did. At one point, the entire company almost up and left. Dylan had to learn very quickly how to be more open to feedback and how to empower his teams, while also hiring experienced managers who could fill his gaps in managerial skills. Eventually, Dylan fell into a bit of a crisis. They had been working on Figma for so long, Dylan began to question if people even wanted this thing, if people even cared. He was dying a bit. The senior members of his team saw this and told him, hey, you need to get some help. Afterward, Dylan took a few days away from the office to reset and absorb what they were saying. It was brutal. This is a moment we'll all face. Not just harsh feedback, but having crises in our own minds, second guessing ourselves, especially when we're trying to change lives or even the world. Lesson number 7, regularly check in with yourself. Keep track of how you're feeling and make sure you can handle everything you're asking of yourself. And if you can't, find a way to outsource, hire, delegate, or learn until you can handle it. When you take the time to reflect, the results can be so rewarding. They certainly were for Figma, because finally, 2 years after raising seed funding, Figma launched their closed beta. The first customer to sign up with Figma during its beta phase was fellow San Francisco-based startup Coda. Coda co-founder and CEO Shishir Maroda said the quality of Figma's tools and its speed won him over. These features were by design, pardon the pun. Figma conducted extensive research studies on designers, learning exactly what was most important. They ran tests where they'd asked the designers to complete a task in Figma and complete the same task in other tools. When they put their app against the industry standard, they quickly realized where their product fell down and were able to immediately pinpoint what to improve. Shishir liked Figma so much, it soon became the backbone of Coda's design team, and he even later decided to invest in Figma himself. Shishir was a Figma fan, but others, well, they weren't as convinced. The thing about designers is that they're typically stubborn about their workflow. They have their process, they have their tools, and they stick to it. And when Figma pitched them the concept of multiplayer design, the designers thought they were crazy. Dylan received a barrage of hate. From "this is an extremely hostile assault on our visual system and workflow" to "if this is the future of design, I'm changing careers." Many designers felt that more transparency would lead to an over-demystification of the design process, more micromanagement, and tighter deadlines. Inviting others into your artboard represented an implicit loss of control, and the very idea of a collaborative, transparent design brought up existential questions like, if anyone can design, what does it mean to be a designer? This onslaught of resistance negativity may have been enough to stop other founders in their tracks, but not Dylan. He asked questions to get information, but wasn't deterred by people who thought he wasn't doing the right thing. He didn't question his own instincts, and his instincts told him that design was undergoing a monumental shift. Dylan had seen the shift in programming already, where what used to be a single-person sport became a team event. He saw the shift in writing too, where writers stepped past huge egos to seek the critical eye of others, and he believed design was destined for the same thing. This brings us to lesson number 8. Study trends in tangential industries. Watch for moments like this. Dylan took lessons from the worlds of programming and writing and brought it over to design. Most people would miss this opportunity. They just focus on the industry in front of them. But remember, inspiration is everywhere, so keep up to date on what's new in different industries. Heck, even just open Product Hunt at the end of every day. You never know what's going to give you that spark of a new idea. But let's get back to the story. Armed with the raving reviews from early adopters and flush with cash after a $14 million Series A funding round led by Greylock partners John Lilly, remember him? This is the power of seeking out and sustaining mentors. Figma worked its way toward a public launch. A year after their closed beta launch, Figma launched fully to the public. Somewhat controversially, Figma remained free to use. What makes this decision controversial is that it's a common piece of advice to start charging money as soon as you can, even before a product even launches. The idea is that if people are willing to pay for your product, that's pretty good validation for the quality and value of what you're building. But Dylan didn't quite subscribe to this philosophy. As word got around about this new free product and people started to realize that Figma was more efficient than the software they were currently using, that's when Figma started to see hypergrowth. Contributing to this hypergrowth was a built-in viral loop. Once someone was introduced to Figma, they wanted to keep using Figma. If they switched jobs, they'd advocate for the use of Figma in their new job. And because Figma is a multiplayer tool, other team members involved in the product cycle would then be introduced to Figma, and if they later switched jobs, they'd advocate for Figma use. It was a perfect recipe for virality. The advice to start charging as early as you can is good advice for most products. But if your product has the potential for built-in virality like Figma, it may be a better option to keep your tool free for as long as possible to facilitate widespread adoption. Figma continued with its widespread growth until a user at Microsoft warned that Figma's adoption was slowing in the tech giant because of doubts that a free startup tool could be trusted. So the team adopted a single-tier pricing model of $12 or $45 per editor, depending on the feature set, with a free forever version as well. Keeping the free version was critical. Dylan wanted designers to be able to test out Figma's product risk-free, perhaps even using it for a personal project first before bringing it to their teams. And after all, the mission of Figma was to make design accessible to all. A free forever version helped achieve that. Pricing models set Figma at a significantly lower price point than its main competitor, the Adobe Creative Cloud, making it more attractive to a broad customer set. And once the pricing decision was set, Dylan stuck with it, not even believing in discounts. When some big-name customers, notably Google, asked for volume discounts, Dylan jumped on the phone with them to explain why Figma wouldn't budge. Their stance was firm, and either people would come around and understand, or they wouldn't, and they wouldn't go with Figma. As much as it was a journey just to start generating revenue, at that point Figma was off to the races. They raised a Series B funding round of $25 million, a Series C funding round of $40 million, and within 4 years of launching, Figma collected over 1 million signups and a customer roster that included Slack, Twitter, Uber, Dropbox, the New York Times, and Microsoft. Most workdays now, Dylan checks Twitter for mentions of Figma and design, or reads customer support tickets as they come in. This allows him to keep a pulse on what's going on, both in terms of Figma and in terms of the sentiment, frustrations, and insights of the overall design world. Figma has raised over $330 million in funding total, including a $200 million Series E funding round raised in 2021, valuing Figma at $10 billion. Forbes estimates that Dylan and Evan each own about 10% of Figma, making them both near billionaires. That's no joke. This was the story of how a 19-year-old college dropout came to build the hottest startup in design. Along the way, we learned 8 main lessons. Don't be afraid to pivot. If you know what you want, don't wait for it to come to you. Go after it with all you've got. Small, free products or tools can be leveraged for virality. Learn from rejection, no matter where it comes from. Get a good mentor and keep them. Don't run away from difficult conversations. Regularly check in with yourself and study trends in tangential industries. For more inspiring startup stories and lessons, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Thank you so much for watching. Give it a thumbs up and leave a comment if you can, and I will see you in the next video.